Hey everyone, welcome to session 2 of Fight For It. We want to dig through a little bit more of what's going on in Ezra and Nehemiah. And so where we find ourselves right now is we find the nation of Israel at one of its lowest points, right? As mentioned earlier, the temple of the Lord, the walls of the city of Jerusalem, the hearts of the people in the land were laying in ruin because of the Babylonians. So really, what was God up to? What was he working out with his people? What was he trying to teach them, right? This is God's promised land, and these are God's promised people, but it's at its lowest point. And so we find in Ezra chapter 1 that what we learn is that in these fights that you and I go through in this life, that the heart to rebuild something that's broken comes first as a burden, right? We see it in King Cyrus, right? And his Medo-Persian army overthrows the Babylonian Empire, and it represents a new day for the Jews in exile. And in Ezra 1:1, it says that the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, right? Cyrus was the one that proclaimed for the Jews that they could return to their city, right? To return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And so God started stirring in Cyrus's spirit to fulfill what God has already promised way back in Abraham. Cyrus invites the Jews to return to their city, return to Jerusalem, and empowers them to rebuild the temple that was lying in ruin. In this same story, after the temple is rebuilt, 90 years later, the walls still lie in ruin. And we find a similar burden that hits not the king this time, but the king's cupbearer. And it's a guy named Nehemiah. And in Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, he asks for a report of what's happening in Jerusalem. And it says, "And they said to Nehemiah, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The walls of Jerusalem are also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven." Do you hear this fight that's forming in Nehemiah's heart? Have you ever been weighed down like this before? Have you ever been overwhelmed by a need that's so big that you don't know even where to begin to maybe fix it or where to go from that moment? What do you need to do when you get weighed down with a burden that God gives you, that God starts stirring in your spirit? This session and next, we want to figure out what are your unique burdens that God has placed in your spirit, right? The guys that were talking to Nehemiah, this wasn't necessarily a burden for them. They were just reporting to him. But knowing your burdens will help you understand where your fight story begins. For Nehemiah, it struck deep and quick, and it took him to his knees. And it's here that something can be noted, right? It's this moment, a burden, a signpost, some realization that alters the course of your life where you just can't shake it. And our fight stories may not be something huge necessarily like Nehemiah. And our fight stories begin with that sense, that same thing though, if something's changed or something must change in order to go forward. And our fight stories often entail what it feels to be up against insurmountable odds. Like I shared last session with my son, insurmountable odds. They gave him a 5 to 10% chance to live. That is insurmountable odds, right? The task before us seems so great, too big that we don't know where to go or how to even begin. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? Maybe you've been weighed down like that before. In these moments, you're just not sure what to do next. And when you've entered the ring, the fight is underway. There's no prepping for it when you're already in the ring and there's a fighter across from you. And so what you need to do is figure out what are your burdens. And you need to start with where you are and what God has already given you. What is unique to you, right? What relationship, what proximity, what burden, what ability or talent do you have that you have at your disposal? And start there and build upon that. Because where you see need around you is going to stir you towards activity. Right? God, break my heart for what breaks yours. It's a beautiful line in a song. And that should be each and every one of our prayers, right? God, give us the lens to have our hearts broken like God's heart breaks when he sees the need in our broken world. Nehemiah immediately responds with prayer. And you can see that in verses 5 through 11, right? At first, he acknowledges who God is. He prays, "O Lord of heaven." And then he confesses the sin of Israel that he had nothing to do with, but it's just the generations behind him. But he also confesses his own sin. And he recalls God's promises to Abraham and all the promises that were fulfilled. And now he knows that there's work to do up to this point. And go ahead and read that prayer wherever you're at and with your group. And I pray that you will begin to pray that God breaks your heart in a way that he broke Nehemiah's. And when he does, I want you to begin to work through and pray how God will equip you to take on these fights that he has placed in your life that start first as a burden. What relationship, proximity, burden, ability, strength, or skill do you have at your disposal? Start there and build on that.